Good morning, evening, afternoon, or whatever time it is in your part of the world. We are live with the Fifth Discipline Book Club episode number 2. On the call, we've got Dave Eva, Eric Willicke, and myself, Mark Richards, and Wolfgang. And we're here to progress a little bit deeper into the book, but I thought before we start, we would just do a quick round robin to say in the kind of 1 or 2 minutes, highlight the week just gone. Have you had any moments that were triggered by the discussion we had last week about the introduction in chapter 1, or a flash of insight of something brilliant you wished you'd said last week and didn't get a chance to? I might throw to Eric to get us rolling.
Mine's a little more meta. I'm also reading Deming's Journey to Profound Knowledge by John Willis right now, and the degree of intertwining of all of the old thought leaders from that era is astounding to me. Just person after person that has influenced my thinking is referenced in how they all work together and how they all connected at the Hawthorne Works, where the famous Hawthorne experiments were done at Stanford in the early days. Kind of just all the wartime collaborations that happened around World War II that set the tone for things we are still discovering and trying to figure out today.
Beautiful. Thank you. Wolfgang, over to you.
The I was like when I had time. Of course, I'm always writing on the solution train large solution framework, and so this was like the discussion that we had last week about the fifth discipline was something that was like a red thread for me throughout the week because I was constantly thinking about and now how do I have to change my way of how I structured solution trains up to now to incorporate all the learnings from the fifth discipline. So do I have like enough attention to all the parts that are covered in fifth discipline in what I'm doing every day? And so I'm not sure. Like before, I would probably have said, yeah, this is something that is a elemental part of that, like a fundamental part of that. But now that we are talking about that, it's more like there is probably more that I could do about that, and I could make that more prominent in what I'm teaching or what I'm doing. And so it's more like a feeling that is constantly that I constantly have when I'm writing, and this is triggered because of the discussion that we had last time. So without the discussion, I would probably not have had that.
Awesome. Mr. Eva.
Well, I mean, I'm currently with a client. We're doing value stream mapping, and of course, you all know with value stream mapping, we're looking at all of the silos that appear in an organization, and we're trying to work out how they got so separated and how we can start to get everyone to see everyone else's perspective. And when you start to see everyone else's perspective, you start to see people thinking in different ways. And so I think that the chapter we're about to cover is just full of amazing insight from 30 years ago about exactly what this stuff is all about. It's just fundamental to what we do. It's fantastic.
Great. So my highlight for the week was a client who luckily trusts me very much, and we were talking, and I said, the beer game. I am just dying to try facilitating the beer game now because the fifth discipline has me so excited about it. And she went, yeah, it's pretty awesome, isn't it? And I went, would you be willing to let me experiment on you? And she said, I've got a leadership offsite coming up next month. Why don't we do it there? And then we chatted a little bit more, and she went, I've got an all hands 2 days later. We could do it there as well. So I get 2 experiments. I get one with a small group where I learn a few things, and then I get one with quite a large group where we get to see it all play out in terms of the key learnings when you get large numbers of people playing it simultaneously. So that was my excitement for the week. I now, of course, have the job of doing endless amounts of research on how to best facilitate it. And it was fun. So last week, introduction, chapter 1. My 18-year-old son is also playing along with the book club. So he asked me where he had to read up to. He watched our show on YouTube while I was cooking dinner the other night. And he yelled out from the TV room, "Okay, Dad, so 40 minutes in and you've just finished the introduction. Welcome to chapter 1. Goodness knows where we'll be today. I have the Miro set up for chapters 2, 3, and 4. We'll see how far we go. But I figured we would start with, of course, chapter 2, and I will just flip to the chapter title. So chapter 2, does your organisation have a learning disability? And I personally found this a pearler of a chapter. So figured we would start with a quick whip around, just looking at the top level of the chapter before we dig into a kind of learning disability by learning disability discussion. What struck you, chapter as a whole, folks?
So for me, like, um, it- I wouldn't say I haven't found any organization which with a learning disability. It's more like, to a degree, I would say every organization probably has a learning disability. So this is something that for me it's an ongoing topic. It's like, what is the degree to which the organization is willing to learn, can learn, or what is the degree that, like, I can change that myself, or what can I contribute to a change there. So I wouldn't say there is any organization out there, at least not from what I have seen, which doesn't have a learning disability to a degree. And the question always is, how far can I get when I try to make things better?
Anybody else?
The size of organizations makes a difference. So I guess we've all worked with very large organizations and quite small organizations, and very often the small organizations know they need to learn and they are actively seeking how to get better. They're actively seeking improvement. Whereas some of the larger organizations tend to be more oil tankerish in terms of turning and changing and even knowing that they have problems. So I think that's an interesting thing, is size is a big indicator of potential willingness to learn, in my experience anyway.
So I probably had two threads running for me with chapter 2. And the first one, I had a moment somewhere in book club preparation where Eric and I were chatting about shaping agility and community evolution. And I reached out to him and said, all that work we've done on values and everything else, we could almost have just replaced it all with become a learning organisation. And it was actually, we were doing a polish on our value statements. As Eric's got a blog post in the work, and we were doing a review cycle on it the other day. And there's an interesting correlation to me between looking at all of the learning disabilities and how we've actually been quite intentional with a lot of our value statements to literally set up value statements that try and counter the various learning disabilities. So even for an organisation which is completely virtual in nature, non-commercial, a small group of people who are dedicated to learning, it's still really important to face into avoiding the learning disabilities. But I think the other one that ran through, and I was just doing a quick refresher last night to make sure everything was in shape on the Miro, that concept of using them as a diagnostic, not all organizations, not all parts of all organizations have every learning disability. Which are the ones that are most present in the area that you're trying to impact? And what can you do based on that recognition? Eric, high-level chapter thoughts?
I don't have any super strong ones. I mean, it's almost a feeling of sadness because, like, we can still use this as a diagnostic. We're this many years on. Many of these things Deming wrote about or Drucker wrote about, and we're still looking at them in the face day after day in a client. Um, and I really don't know what to do with that, other than keep singing the chorus and sharing the goals as best we can. Um, I hesitate with the diagnostic mindset a little bit. It's useful to be aware of what challenges exist, but I unfortunately, it's all too easy to find symptoms of each one of these to the point where it's almost a better conversation to start with which ones are impacting us the most instead of trying to do some sort of active diagnostic and really just look at it. It's like what do people actually see as we look at leaders? What are they already aware of, and start there because there's already energy there. Or if there isn't, if it's the anti energy of we're so tired of talking about this, then maybe pull out the other six and see if there's another starting point.
I don't know that when I think of it as a diagnostic, it's a diagnostic that I would necessarily share with the organization when I think of it that way. It's that I would use it in my coaching thinking. And I think, to your point, you can use a diagnostic two ways. You can go, here's a place where they're struggling, and how can I help them to recognize it for themselves rather than telling them they've got that problem. But the flip side is, going back to switch and, shining the spotlight on something good where they've got an aspect of the disabilities that actually, no, they haven't got that problem. They're pretty strong in that space. How do you amplify that?
And I
So,
do like the positive spin. Again, going back to strengths based and growth language makes these a lot more powerful. But at that point, I'm wondering if we're talking about a different chapter.
yeah, that's jumping way ahead for me in the linkage. But it was when I read the chapter, I was thinking about this, turn up the good versus reveal the bad. And I've very much lived over the last few years on the turn up the good or shine the spotlight on the positive mantra. But if I jump ahead a few chapters to where we talk about reinforcing loops versus balancing loops, and that usually the big points of leverage sit in a balancing loop, that starts to raise questions. But we'll be back there, I suspect, next week. So,
I think.
so go on.
Good.
You had a thought. And as Max said to
I
me
did.
after watching the show, he said, every time Eric opens his mouth, I get excited.
Well, I don't want to raise expectations too much. In this case, I was just looking through your notes on the board, and I really appreciate the quote you have at the bottom that you pulled from Jared Diamond. Might be a useful one to anchor the next phase of discussion, just because it's really does get to that diagnostic mindset and what to do with something that is diagnostic in nature.
So, sharing the quote for anybody who's listening rather than watching, it is like failing organizations, most of those inside the empire sense that all is not quite right, but their instincts are to more strongly defend their traditional ways of doing things rather than to question them, let alone develop the capacity to change those ways. And it was a really interesting tie up given the amount of reference examples that he uses throughout the book to actually look at the rise and fall of civilization through a learning organization lens. Did you care to expand on that quote at all, Eric?
I don't know. It was more of like, as a consultant, yes, there's the water. We see it.
Yeah.
And the number of times that instinct comes up um, towards the end of a cycle is astounding. And it's not just Jared Diamond, it's a number of different book sources and things I've been reading around the ebb and flow of communities and the ebb and flow of nation states. Um, that head in the sand element is not, it's tied in maybe to the boiled frog, but it's a piece of awareness that transcends all of these to me, is just being aware that people don't necessarily want to hear it. Because what do we know about convincing people on the internet with data?
So I figured we might actually just kind of focus in a little bit on each of the disabilities or pairs of disabilities. So I've just got a couple of key quotes from each disability to refresh heads in our conversation. So starting with, I am my position and the enemy is out there. Floor is open. Key moments for anybody with those learning disabilities. I might kick us off while you guys all think. I loved really hard The Enemy is Out There. And, you know, it's a recurring theme in a lot of books that we read and a lot of concepts we read. But I just thought Senge put it very powerfully. And you can apply it on so many levels. We see it again and again in the Agile community, where a community that's meant to be based on collaboration often seems to be anything but. They should fix this, they're getting this wrong, as opposed to what can we do to change it, shape it, influence it for the better. The buzz phrase Eric introduced me a little while ago too was shoulding. I'm not sure, what was the source of shoulding, Eric? Where did you pick it up from?
I pulled it from Brene Brown, and I think it was Dare to Lead. It might have been the previous one. But just really that shoulding of self and shoulding of others that leads to shame. And it's a slightly different concept than the enemy is out there, but it's so close. My other version of it is a little different than shoulding. It's there is no they, and a lot of agile coaches, I think, they have that twitch response to the word resources, and I'm like, cool, they're resources, whatever you want to think of your people as for the moment. But then I turn around and have that same twitch anytime hear the word they, and like I want to correct, like, who's they? Who are you actually talking about? What's this anonymous cloud of responsibility you're assigning somewhere else? And that's not particularly helpful necessarily, but I think it gets a lot further than the people versus resources argument.
Yeah, I
I
love
like
the.
the
Oh, sorry, go on, Dave.
I am my position bit.
Yep.
I quite like the I am my position bit, and that bit where it says in the book that there's a contrast between American car manufacturing and Japanese car manufacturing, where the Japanese car manufacturing they've designed it so that lots of single things can be done with one design. So the bolts they've got like one bolt shape. I think that maps back to what we do when if we work with teams and we're trying to get teams to work together. We don't want devs to just do testing and dev and testers just to do testing. We want them to get together and work together and collaborate together. So we're trying to break down these silos at kind of all layers of the business. And I think for me that's a very important one. Is if you just say I am this role and I'm not prepared to learn other things, then we're not going to get anywhere, are we?
No. No, it's a lovely example, the multiple bolts. time and time again, people have pulled examples out around the way Toyota designed the whole rather than
You've
just the
been there
parts.
too.
Yeah,
You've seen it for
yeah.
real, haven't you? You've actually been there. You're so lucky, man.
Wolfgang, anything jumping out for you? I am my position. The enemy is out there. And you've muted yourself.
Mute. Now I have it. So, what came to my mind with I am my position is that it starts early on, actually. Like last time when we spoke about chapter 1, we also spoke about education systems. And like this is something that is brought to every student or every pupil early on, saying, "Hey, I'm the teacher. I'm the one saying what you have to do." Now, this is something that is so ingrained in our educational system that it's not like the teacher who is there helping you and trying to solve some problems, but the teacher is the one who is actually giving you orders, or you have to fulfill certain things, and it's not like a collaborative effort to learn or go through school or at the university through your studies. So it's so natural when you get out of that system. You have been to school, I don't know, 12 years, 13 years or whatever, and then you go to the university and you are there for another, say, 5, 6 years or whatever. And then after like this almost 20 years of brainwash, you go into any kind of company, and then there is someone else who tells you what exactly to do. And this is the position that this person has, where this person derives the authority from. Now, of course, you want to get in a certain position where you have a certain ability to influence things, and so you try to get up the ladder because you were told so in the first place, like from the earliest years on. And so I think to change that, you really have to overcome a lot of traumas that probably people have brought with them through the education system, and to soften that problem, it's probably like a good idea to bring people just together in whatever kind of collaboration workshops or whatever, where it doesn't really matter what the people like, what the rank of the peoples are. It's just like, okay, what is the output that we can get out of that, and then we have to collaborate. And it doesn't really matter where who you are or what your position in the company is. So I think this is really tough to overcome, because there are so many people who identify themselves with that, because this is what they worked on all their life to get in that position. And as so many people are holding that paradigm up, like, oh yeah, I'm also my position. So it's so easy to look at all the others, say, yeah, but this is how the world works.
I know for me, when I looked sort of the enemy is out there was a really interesting one in terms of, sorry, not the enemy, the I am my position. Because for me, instantly position goes to role. But then when you read his commentary, position was also perspective. This is the position that I've occupied, the position that I've taken. And the level of fixation that then becomes based on that. And there's a kind of tie back to me. I read a book a few years ago, and I can't remember what the title was now, but it was a guy who, I think he's a conductor, and he runs management workshops, and particularly leadership style workshops, where he literally takes management groups in to where an orchestra is performing. And he positions them in different parts of the room. And the thing that he's trying to teach them is that when an orchestra is playing, the position you're sitting in, particularly if you're sitting behind them, completely changes what you hear. And yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful book. I must dig it out in the post notes for the edit. But the illustration he gave, because what he would do would be that he'd conduct a piece, and generally he didn't sit them in front of the orchestra, he sat them behind it. And he'd conduct a piece, and then he'd debrief to go, what did you hear? What was happening for you? And they would all be just completely startled by the completely different pieces that each of them had heard, because wherever they sat, something dominated, and there were some things they didn't hear at all. And that notion of I'm somewhere in the world, I'm somewhere in an organization, I'm seeing the world from where I'm standing, and there's only a limited picture that comes to me with the perspective of the position that I occupy. And that was the thing that jumped as soon as I kind of read below those. And I found quite regularly with his learning disabilities, he'd have a beautiful little tagline like I'm in my position or the enemy's out there, and then you'd actually read the deeper text and go, he's talking about something more than just what meets the eye when you see his tagline. I'm surprised, Wolfgang, you didn't go, it's this book and I know it, given your obsession with music.
No, but I definitely want to read it. So
I'm like, are you going, no, it's not our filmmaking. What are you talking about?
I
I
will.
really love the analogy.
It
Thank you.
was a lovely book. I read it and I went, I'd love to go on one of those. But then I do that all the time. So let's move on.
It is I was
Sorry,
going to say
go on.
that's a theme that Heidi Heflin explores a lot in her dynamic reteaming book as well, is people's identities to their team or to the
Yeah.
product or platform they support.
Yeah.
And one of the ones perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was quite surprised about with my last large client is the degree of defensiveness that developers and even up to director level had for the platforms and like apps they support. And something that I thought would be relatively minor, like let's just retire a few apps so people can work on newer, cooler technology. People just started digging in their heels, and you heard every excuse known to humankind coming up. And I thought at first it was like, okay, it's resistance to change, stereotype, blah, blah, blah. And the more you dug in, it's like, no, they actually had associated their identity with the apps they'd been building for 3, 5, 7 years, whatever the number is. And shifting where that identity was connected to became the first step in driving change. It's not just, oh, we're going to retire your app. It's your app is becoming part of this powerful thing that then Strangler ID, blah, 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 to start to fix it.
All right, moving. The illusion of taking charge and the fixation on events. And I will just flip those back on screen. So the illusion of taking charge, this is tackling being proactive and various challenges in proactiveness, and fixation on events, like the drive to see life as a series of events rather than the whole. I particularly love the fixation on events personally, but you guys, what jumped out to you for these two learning disabilities? And while you're thinking, I'll say welcome, Sahil. And take yourself off mute.
Thanks, Mark. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Hope I'm not disrupting a great conversation too much.
Right now, you are disrupting thinking time. We're in chapter 2, talking about learning disabilities, and we have the illusion of taking charge and the fixation on events in focus.
Ooh, okay. Great. So, what are we documenting our thinking somewhere, or are we just thinking about it?
Well, if you had done your homework, you'd be on the Miro. You'd be following along
I'm
on the Miro.
opening the Miro right now. All right.
So I'm going to go to the fixation on events. maybe to trigger a bit of thought. That kind of starting quote on, being conditioned to see life as a series of events, and for every event we think there's a possible cause or an obvious cause, one obvious cause. That turns up so powerfully to me in high-pressured environments. I was chatting to somebody the other day about, coaching execs and the time-poor nature of executive life, and the absolute fear, shock, and horror that comes into your mind when you see an executive's diary and you see a 50-hour week, which is 130-minute meetings. And you ponder, how did they get time for deep thinking? As opposed to just running from event to event to event. Particularly if there are kind of high pressure world where there's all kinds of stuff coming at them that's looking for them to react fast, have it under control. But then their life is just this series of short tick, 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 tick. And they all value that chance to get back and do deep thinking. But they get it so infrequently. Or in fact, the only way they get it is if late at night they don't have a board paper to write and they can't turn their brain off. And so they put the kids to bed and then do deep thinking at night. And then when you think about the fact that that is pretty much every senior executive in every large enterprise I've ever worked with, and worse after COVID than before, because it's now the king of the 30-minute meeting. How do you help them to get the chance to be able to step back and start to connect the events rather than just live in the events?
I think the technology we have today, where we're extracting so much data from so many systems that gives us so much data all the time. We're designing our environments to be these tiny little time frames of data coming back at us, and we're reacting best from all this data. I mean, if you're observing live systems like with all this alerts going off all the time, I mean, your life is just one series of half-hour traumas throughout the whole day, isn't it?
This goes back to, and I feel like it was one of our first couple streams, we had a pretty long discourse on executive empathy and the number of consultants, especially a number of people that just don't have a deep-seated sense of empathy for that world and the pressures, especially as you get to more senior roles in public listed companies. And as I read the combination of taking charge and the fixation on events, that is exactly what they're rewarded for most of the time. None of these events became traumatic for the larger population because we protected from it. And I did something that helped prevent that from keeping harm. And that ongoing reactivity and, I hate the term bias for action, but that bias for action mindset that comes from being in the reactivity mode, the harm of it is extreme. But then you talk about deep thinking, and I start to think about the experiments helping people get deep thinking, and when they're not practiced at it, how unsatisfying those first few experiments are. No matter how well facilitated, no matter how much data you brought to help seed the deep thinking, what inspirational leaders or perspectives or technologists or whatever, it's really hard to trigger quality deep thinking for people who aren't used to doing it. And I have empathy as I push people through that journey sometimes, but it is a push.
So for me, my first thought when I read that the fixation on events was something completely different. And I don't know even whether this is like meant with that, but like the first association that I had was like, what we are doing when we are helping companies to transform is usually also a fixation on events. Like when you look at the Scrum framework, for instance, you have all these events, and this is the backbone, like the sprint planning, dailies, reviews, retros. This is the backbone of the transformation. It's like, really, isn't that a fixation on events? Like, couldn't you do things in a different way? And this is like with almost every agile transformation that I was part of or that I've seen, is like, okay, either the events are the backbone of what we're doing there, like we're introducing PI plannings when we're introducing safe and things. Not that I say this is bad, it's just like, um, this is either the backbone of what we're doing, like introducing events, trying to make events better, or at least it's a really big part. For most of the transformation that I have seen, I would say it's the backbone. It's the most important thing, the events. And so, the sentence down there, generative learning cannot be sustained in an organization if people thinking is dominated by short-term events. I think this is true to a degree, of course, but to a degree, when we are just running in circles, like just running in sprints, and this is all the things that we have, or just running in PI. So this fixation on events, and this was like the thoughts that came up. But when I read that, not that I say this is like something that is written in the book, but it's like my thinking when I read that. This is maybe something that we have to overcome, maybe not completely, because events are important, but to a certain extent, where we say, hey, is it really that important that we are structuring everything with events? Couldn't we do it in different ways, where we also have a better learning effect, and not just trying to prepare for the next sprint planning, for the next daily, for the next PI planning, or whatever? Not that I have an answer to that question, but this is a question that I have asked myself.
I can see you've prompted
It's
some thought in Sahil.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, I agree, Wolfgang, and I kind of read that sentence the same way. Um, and the thought that it triggers in my head is, I've been in quite a few organizations where we're doing some state of the transformation report, once a quarter or something. We're going to do a readout to some senior vice president or C-level executive, and we have to prepare that presentation. And preparing that presentation requires 12 different one-on-ones with every direct report of that C-level executive to approve the presentation, have their say in the messaging, and then finalize and double check that we're all in agreement. And then I've experienced that in a microcosm as we're preparing for, SPRs, strategic portfolio reviews, and things like that. But when I hear that generative learning can't take place in an organization that is focused on the event, that's what I think of. I think of, hey, we just put 50 man hours into preparing for a 30-minute readout for one person, because that one person has to have this perfectly curated message, and everyone needs to make sure that their piece of it is perfect. And to me, that's almost worse than, at least when you say, hey, we're preparing for sprint planning or we're preparing for PI planning, at least that's value added activity, right? At least then you're preparing for an event that is going to generate and position you for the future. And no offense to any C-level executive that's watching this, but a lot of the time when we're preparing those state of the transformation reports, I can't say that that's a super value added activity. That's just checking a box like a financial audit. Are we spending money on the right thing or not? It's not transformative for the organization. But it's probably the single most important thing on all of those people's minds as we're preparing for it. And this really makes me think about how do we even position that differently to say, how do we turn this into a learning opportunity, right? It's not the event itself is the approval, the event is the learning opportunity. And then maybe you can start to think about it differently and talk about it differently.
I'm interested in the shift in the conversation. I read the language around events in terms of cause and effect. And I have been listening to this conversation flow into terms of events that we hold and events that we do. And at first I was gonna like do the recoil and correct thing. And I'm like, actually there's some really interesting conversation to be had in the difference and why we might jump from one to the other in our own mindsets.
I think both perspectives are equally valid. I probably agree, Eric, that when when Peter wrote the book, he was talking about cause and effect and events for action oriented sequences. But I think, at least for me, just when I read the sentence, my mind went to event based planning, and um, that's just where I ended up after reading the book. I think that's um, it is interesting for sure. Probably a different facet to explore, but uh, I would really like to talk about learning based events.
I,
Like,
I, I think it's an interesting. So my journey was slightly different to Eric's as I listened, but there were some commonalities because Wolfgang started and I went, I hadn't at all thought about agile events when I read this section. I thought about stuff that happens in an organization. And then the conversation started and I went, oh, I do like that correlation of the kind of event-based drivers that often come along with agile of any flavor and the common dysfunction that agile is the events. But then as Sahil started talking about the executive events and the craziness they drive, my mind jumped to, actually, it jumped all the way back to your position. Because in my days when I thought I knew more and I understood the world, I used to sit and have long rants about all of the craziness of demands for information that stopped us doing valuable work. But the more that I coached at more senior levels, the more I understood the things that drove all of that. And this is where I think that cause and effect correlation becomes interesting. If life is a series of events that are asking you to spend a lot of time preparing polished information, what is the thing that is causing that ongoing series of events and requests to occur? And if you jumped across and you started to think about failure demand versus value demand, I would argue that quite often that series of events, the request for a deck, and it's a common thing. Senior leadership, life is all about what's the next deck that's due to which forum. But why do these demands come? They quite often come because the information is not readily available. Right? They're a failure demand. I don't know something I need to know. And because it's not instantly available, I have to ask somebody to curate it for me. But then you could go a little bit deeper to that to go, actually, that senior person who needs that information and needs that half-hour presentation, well, that could be your C-level executive who has the diary full of 130-minute meetings in a week. And they need that information available to them to answer questions that come at them in their sessions, whether it's from the board or from an industry analyst or, some other place. So it's a genuine need from somebody who is incredibly time poor to have information at their fingertips. And if you take a generative view on that, it's, well, is there another way to have that information at their fingertips? As opposed to, it's ridiculous how much time we spend preparing PowerPoint decks for 30-minute presentations to that person. And to me, that's the shift when you start to think about it through a cause and effect learning loop. I can see the events. If I can see a pattern to the events, then I can start to say, where might I find leverage to change the pattern? It's very depressing when you realize the life of senior execs. Makes me glad I never was one.
So I think my
Oh.
first takeaway. So go ahead, Mark.
No, go for it. Give me a fourth takeaway, and then we'll segue.
Okay, I was I was just gonna make a joke. I think my first takeaway was that Mark called me young. Or possibly not quite worldly enough yet. But I do like the pattern you just described and where you're going. I didn't mean to imply that there's no value in preparing that information. I think where I was focusing from the perspective of generative learning was there's no value in trying to communicate that information perfectly. The amount of time being spent on perfect communication and perfect information is not worth the return when we could have done imperfect communication with 95% of the information in half the time.
And that is a very valid point. And you are young to heal, but that's I wasn't. I wasn't calling you young. It's literally
No, young enough to still think I know everything is what I took away from your.
I'm old enough to know I don't know everything. But I often look back at me as a younger agile coach, and I just shudder at some of the stances that I took and opinions that I had, and the complete lack of understanding. And I've actually had a lot of flashbacks to that with the fifth discipline, because I'll be reading, or last night I was just popping a couple of extra quotes in case we managed to get a few chapters deeper. And it was that flashbacks to it. Oh, I remember when I looked at the world like that. I remember when I was completely oblivious to this. And, how different as you get taught about the way different things work by your clients, how different that causes your perspective to be. Before you understood, for example, let me take an easy example from recent times. If you're a bank in Australia, we have an organisation called APRA, which is the regulator for banks. And when APRA turns up, and they will turn up periodically, and they will turn up for 6 weeks, you lose. Every senior executive in the bank has no time for anything else for 6 weeks, except keeping APRA happy. And once upon a time, it was like, oh, they're never present, they're never available. And why do we keep losing momentum on these important things? Until you realize, oh, it's because APRA. And, in my team coach or developer days, APRA was something you read about in the newspaper, as opposed to something that influenced the lives of the people who influenced the lives of the next people who eventually influenced my day-to-day activities. So,
Sounds like systems thinking, which was also one of the fifth discipline's 5.
all right, let's move on. Boiled frog and delusion of learning from experience. So I love the boiled frog story. Had a great chat about that in the home the other night, um, explaining this concept of the boiled frog and the fact that if you heat the pot up slowly enough, the frog never recognizes the fact that it's about to become threatening and never jumps out of the pot. I thought the interesting thing that Senge brought out for me, because I've heard the boiled frog story a lot of times, but the interesting thing Senge brought up was the fact that as the temperature rose, it impaired the frog's cognitive ability to recognize the rising threat. And that not just that the threat was so gradual they didn't recognize it, but actually, as the threat increased, the frog's cognitive ability was impaired. And
So
that was fascinating for me. Far away, Sea Hill.
I was just going to agree. I've heard this parable, probably a dozen or more times in my life, and reading this book was the first time I heard not just that the cognitive ability of the frog might be impaired, which set me down a whole rabbit hole of thinking. But also for that first 10 degrees or so, the frog might even enjoy it. That's also the first time I read that. um, and and that also, like, it really extended the metaphor for me, I guess, is how to say it, because I really started to think about, what are the most common and destructive anti-patterns are the ones that we embrace, not just because it's easier, but because they're more fun, or they're more communal in the early stages, and then it falls apart later on when we're not prepared for the long-term consequences. So I don't know if this was the I'm not going to say that Senge was probably the first person to write it, but he was the first person to put a lot of color on this parable for me.
So, oh, sorry, go on, Morphin.
So I had again a complete different thought, and so my mind went into a complete different direction with this boiled frog analogy. It was like um, when like the first idea of the Scrum framework was that, like, when you look at Zone to Win from Jeffrey Moore, like the first idea of Scrum was that you have a tool for the transition zone, that you say, okay, I have a certain revenue stream, and this is what my company relies on, but probably the temperature goes up because there are different technologies around, like the switch from a normal photo camera to a digital camera or something. Now the temperature goes up because the quality of digital cameras gets better and better. Now the initial idea of the Scrum framework, when you look into the new product development game paper, was to establish teams, small teams, which are able to do something about it. Like the temperature rises, there is a change in the environment that your company lives in, and then you have these small teams, and they try to come up with a new revenue stream or something that you can put into the transition zone, and then it becomes the next revenue stream. Now, for me, this was like when I read that, it was interesting because it was like, okay, but actually, Scrum was meant to do exactly that, but almost no company that I know of is using Scrum for that. It's like you have a software development department, and you let the people run in Scrum mode. So they use the Scrum framework because it's the agile way of doing things, and you're running in sprints and so on. Now, the initial idea is something actually completely different. It's like the temperature is rising, and you are bringing a Scrum team in so that you can react to what is coming up. Now, like when he talked about like that you don't have the cognitive like capabilities to realize what is happening, is like, did we actually do in most of the transformations where it's just like where Scrum is just applied to IT development or something? Did we, as agile coaches, actually go exactly in that direction? Like, you have a tool and you use that for something completely different than what it was meant in the first place. Now, when something comes up that rises the temperature and you have to react to that, now you don't recognize that this tool actually was meant for that. And because it's so convenient to have like multiple Scrum teams in your organization. And so, like, what is actually the thing that we are doing when we see that the temperature rises, or when the environment is doing, like, is behaving in a complete different way than what it was behaving before? And do we really have anything like in exchange to Scrum when we are devoting Scrum to IT development? And there is nothing, at least not from my experience, where I could say, okay, when the temperature is rising, when the environment changes, we are actually doing something else because we are devoting Scrum to that part. Now we are using something else for trying to come up with new ideas, changing revenue streams and things like that. So I think this is probably far away from what he wrote in the book, but actually this was what came to my mind, saying, hey, are we actually using Scrum for something that it was never meant to be? And now we don't have a tool when it comes to that situation because Scrum actually mended the gap in the first place. And now we are like sight impaired, so to speak, because we are using it for complete different things.
There's a quote 2 chapters on that speaks exactly to that. I've just flashed it on screen on the mirror at the moment. Pushing harder and harder on familiar solutions while fundamental problems persist or worsen is a reliable indicator of non-systemic thinking. What we often call the what we need here is a biggest hammer syndrome.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
I think that you mentioned Wolfgang, that when he wrote the book, and he wrote the book in the 90s, and it says a little bit earlier in chapter 2, it says that the average age of an organization in that at that point in the world was 40 years, and the business cycles are so short now that it's unbelievable, and yet our ability to sense that, I think, is probably not really evolved at all. So it is a crazy thing that the world is this fast now, and we are that not adjusted to seeing this whole cycle getting so fast.
Thank you, Dave.
So we've got 2 learning disabilities left. We've been running for about an hour. It feels like we tackle these 2 learning disabilities and then do a quick wrap on the conversation. So go back to the delusion of learning from experience. And this one really, I quite enjoyed, and it was a little bit confronting. So the quote, and by the way, if you're wondering why some quotes are in different colors, I have like a color grading system that says it was a good quote and I highlighted it and saved it. There's no background color. It was a quote that really made a difference for me. Like it was a standout quote. The background becomes the light blue. And then it was a amazing quote. The background becomes green. There's a couple of those in the next couple of chapters. So this one, we each have a learning horizon, a breadth of vision in time and space within which we assess our effectiveness. When our actions have consequences beyond our learning horizon, it becomes impossible to learn from direct experience. And I think the reason this one hit me between the eyes was we live in a world where we talk about learn by doing and shorten feedback cycles to accelerate learning. And yet he's talking about this notion of the challenge of not having the breadth of vision in time and space within which to assess our effectiveness. And
So,
what jumps out there? It's an interesting provocation.
it is really interesting. And I think we could, if we weren't trying to wrap up pretty soon, I think we could probably spend 20 minutes just talking about what is a learning horizon in this context, right? Because the way he's talking about it, right? It's almost like every context and every experience could have its own learning horizon for how prepared you are to follow that specific thing through to its consequences or not. Because this learning horizon is sort of the scope of which I can see and experience and take in new knowledge, learning, feeling about something. And I would challenge, or I would expect that the learning horizon, like my learning horizon for portfolio, for example, is much larger than my learning horizon for um, agile HR. Just because that's not where I spend most of my time. Um, and so I think the level of detail you can get to in this conversation and applying it and thinking about what it means for you as an individual is tremendous. And that's not to diss Agile HR. I actually use it a lot in portfolio. It was just an example.
So I see this as another one where it's kind of like the two meanings of events, and the mindset here, I think, is almost going back to plan, do, check, adjust, or plan, do, sense, whatever language you prefer, is how long before you sense? How long do we wait before we try to measure the impact of what we've done? If I come out of a facilitation event with a group of leaders and I measure it the next morning, people are still buzzing and excited. Like it can be a pretty bad low outcome event, but later that day they're tired, low outcomes. The next morning they're buzzing because they're at least thinking. And a week later there could be nothing and it could be flatlined. But then take that same event, maybe a more powerful, effective version of that event. The next week might still seem flatlined because everybody's recovering and catching up with their other workload. But 3 months out, I can look at it and say, wow, the impact of that event was company changing. And some ways I look back now and I get data points from like launches I did 10 years ago, practically, maybe more now. And those initial solution train launches, thinking of an insurance company, big initiative way back, I can see the ripples of that in their agile transformation today, 12 years later, 10 years later. And the impact it's had and the speakers that have come out of it and the learning that it's had and the revenue impact it's had. So I start to really pay attention to sampling horizon when I read this, not just like my own cognitive processes, but when do we sample? When do we evaluate our effectiveness on something?
I would almost feel like that's just the other side of the same coin in this context, right? I don't even think it's two different interpretations of learning horizons. It's you know, what is that cycle of sensing that you just described? But then, in the book, when he's talking about it in terms of, hiring new executives or making a major change to the organizational strategy, that learning cycle might be 5, 10 years long. And the people who could learn from it are not the people who made the choice. Frequently they've moved on. Right. And so I think that's the disconnect that Sengi was highlighting when he was talking about it. And it just feels very meaningful for us in our daily lives as well.
I think Senge used the beer game to force a learning horizon, didn't he?
Yeah.
I think that's where certain experiential training sessions are. You force the learning horizon to be within a very, very tiny time range, so they get to experience a little bit of the frustration, and then they see a way out of it because you've forced the circumstances to teach them something they never would have learned themselves. So I think experiential learning, again, is a powerful way to mitigate this. It's not going to fix it forever, but it's certainly a halfway house to getting out of some situations that require very long learning cycles.
I think for me, one of my triggers, right, is I'm a metrics junkie, and particularly an impact metrics junkie, and most of you know that. You've listened to me rant about the things. And I think the provocation to me was layering your metrics. And we know that we look for leading indicators, and we obsess about helping people with leading indicators because they give us rapid sensing. But then you've also got your lagging indicators, and perhaps this is, what are you learning or sensing when you ship a feature versus what are you sensing when you look at portfolio performance versus what are you sensing when you look at share price, right? And if you actually start to think about it, a lot of those metrics, if you start to think about them as horizon-based metrics, generate different types of learning. And, a leading indicator can go, is stuff moving in the right direction? But then you can come back and correlate it and say, when the lagging indicator turns up, does that actually prove out that what I initially thought was happening in terms of the leading indicators turned up in the way it was meant to when the time horizon expands? And that was, I think, for me, the piece when I thought about this, learning horizon basis is, people might change roles, but metrics don't. The right metrics can become institutional knowledge. And I can see Eric going, well, I want to challenge you on that, Mark. But thinking about that notion of, can we think about time horizon based learning in the way that we layer our metric structures becomes a really fascinating topic. And, I certainly know when I help people with OKRs, I will generally go, well, let's start with a 3 to 5 year view, right? What are the OKRs that tell us where we want to be 3 to 5 years from now? And then let's zoom back and say, let's look at 1 year. And, what are the things that we could set as OKRs in the next 1 year that would, particularly from a key result perspective, tell us whether we're heading towards the thing that we're wanting 3 to 5 years from now. Right. So it's not just our objectives are, what are we chasing in the first year? It's what are we learning in the first year in terms of our key results that give us better insight about whether the 3 to 5 years is likely to happen. And then I zoom back one more time and I go, let's talk about the next quarter. What could change in the next quarter that indicates that we're heading towards the change we want to see in the next year? And you very often in an OKR setting, you start with quarterly. And quarterly is great because you can actually live the quarterly as opposed to publish it and file it. But if you're not out there setting those longer horizon key results, particularly, then you can really struggle to contextualize the shorter time horizon ones. But before I made a little soapbox buzzer button as an enhancement of Wolfgang's whip crack, and I suspect if Eric had the buzzer, he would have just soapbox buzzed me. So I'm going to get off it because I can see Eric's added something to the Miro. Eric, share a little bit about the diagram you just added?
I don't know. There's not much to share other than I'll just point out the annotation, the adoption of, let's call it a precursor to safe. It was very safe-esque at about the time safe was becoming defined. For a small company, household name that I won't recognize, but relatively small. This is long-term data. I mean, you all, I believe, can recognize a stock graph, and I don't think there's too much argument, unless you just don't believe in capitalism, that growing from $6 a share to 70 something dollars a share when COVID hit um, isn't an achievement. But I look at this at the time of adoption, and who would have said, other than perhaps Deming, since I was just reading that you'll see a 10x improvement in your share price in the next 10 years? Like, I'm not going to stand there and say that as a consultant. And I know people still at the company that are still, oh, that are still there all these years later, and they don't look at this. They don't see this as cause and effect, even though they lived through it. I only did because I was looking at it for marketing purposes 3 years after it happened. And I was like, oh, look, they've doubled their share price. And then a couple of years later, they did it again and again. It's like, oh, wow. But like, that inflection point is laser clear, like super clear, because they started deploying 6 times as often. Well, it's really more of a DevOps story, I think, in the end of it. So I just think about this in the context of what Senge wrote, and I don't know how to get around it. Before I close the chapter, there's a couple notes after the disabilities I want to highlight too, but we can. I don't want to rush this out too quick.
Why don't we do myth of the management team and then go to your couple of quotes that you're sitting on, Eric, and then call it a wrap. So, myth of the management team. Depressingly familiar when you look at the opening quote there. Teams in business tend to spend their time fighting for turf, avoiding anything that will make them look bad personally, and pretending that everyone is behind the team's collective strategy. It was like, really, his comment about the learning disability was the delusion of alignment. My personal transition is, if you can't have an argument, you're not likely to change anything. You've got to build the ability to have constructive conflict rather than just continue to live with a whole bunch of unspoken topics in public that everybody knows are happening in private.
Head shaking and sadness of the number of times I've seen this, and the number of anecdotes that are could be shared around this.
So notice you've added a couple of your own quote highlights to the side, Eric. I think it was Eric, or was it somebody else?
It was me. Actually, before we move on from myth of the management team, it's the one refreshing breath of fresh air, or the breath of fresh air I've read in the last year around that was an everybody culture, or an everyone culture. And it really is a deep case study of 3 companies where that's not the case. And it was one of those books I read through, like, oh, something like that could get me back to a full-time job. It was almost the vibe and the eye-opening, like, oh, it can be like that. And I've been in a couple of small places like that, but not at this scale.
Why don't you keep the floor? 2 highlights. So just to share them, even if we feel uncertain or ignorant, we learn to protect ourselves from the pain of appearing uncertain or ignorant. That very process blocks out any new understandings which might threaten us. The consequence is what Argyris calls skilled incompetence. Teams full of people who are incredibly proficient at keeping themselves from learning. That's glorious.
He has a way with words, and the usefulness of this quote as a summary that brings the rest of this chapter together is just kind of brilliant. It's in the well, I'll have to paraphrase on this one, but the same caliber as never expect a man to learn that which his career depends on not knowing. And I forget the original quote. I've used a couple of synonyms in there.
Yep.
But the number of times I've seen this where, in the face of cognitive dissonance, in the face of information that feels threatening or feels like work even, people just will step back and choose to ignore it, consciously or subconsciously. And it's not, Unfortunately, it's a learned habit. It is a very strong behavior of learned helplessness that I struggle with when I see it, and I don't. It's one I don't have a solution to either. So it starts with leadership, and you don't change it from the outside.
So, second one you've got here. Each participant made well-motivated, clearly defensible judgments based on reasonable guesses about what might happen. There were no villains, but there was a crisis nonetheless built into the structure of the system. So I go straight here to Deming. You know, bad systems beat good workers every day of the week.
Yeah, it's Deming. It's the beer game. Actually, I think that one might.
That one feels like you've grabbed it from the beer game because it feels like a reference from the beer game.
Yeah, it really is. It's not the one that I expected to follow. The one I meant to highlight and drop there is the large scale version of this. I think my notes didn't update. These learning and disabilities have been with us a long time. In the March of Folly, Barbara Trickman traces history of devastating large scale policies pursued contrary to ultimate self interest. And it's that contrary to ultimate self interest that really jumped out at me because I see that all the time. Like, as a leader, I want to keep control so I can protect myself, but I get more control if I let go. And it's a lot of those behaviors we see that are instinct in the short term is based on well intentioned, well thought through leadership behaviors that actually harms us in the long run.
Which is a beautiful forward link to one of his laws of systems thinking a couple of chapters down the path, which is you can have your cake and eat it too, but not at the same time. So we've made it through a chapter, hour and 20 minutes. I think we keep doing the retro. Quick call out. I'm going to start for me. Felt like we struggled a little bit for pace today. And I wasn't sure if that was because I was trying to deliberately structure us through or what it was. Felt like when I just threw the floor open on a new topic, there was a long stunned silence. Life went a little bit better when I did a quick nudge. Here, we're opening the next section. Here's something to get the conversation rolling. But I'm trying to be, not controlling and leaving space for everybody in this, balanced against keeping the conversation flowing. So I'm interested in feedback for iteration for the next one. I love the deep focus conversations, as opposed to the high level, let's jump all over the place. What are your thoughts? What do we change for next week?
I'll respond to the delays. For me, it's more of a logistical delay because I'm finding myself attempting to cross-reference the highlights based on location numbers in my highlights log, the page numbers in the book view, and the topic anchors in the Miro view. So, like, when it's a section-based question, it takes me a minute just to find, okay, that's this section, this highlight was from that section, and you're saying this, okay, now I can contribute. Don't know what to do about it, but just putting an interpretation on top of the pause for me.
So from my side, the delay came from a different source, and like what I really liked about what we did today was saying, okay, now this is the scope of the session. Now we want to go through the second chapter, and these are the topics that we want to speak about on the Miro board. And it was clear to me that as we are 5 here, and we have a certain amount of topics to go through, that we will not have a lot of time on each of the topics. And so the delay for me from my side came from thinking about, like, I had a lot of things to share, but I didn't want to to take too much airtime. And so I thought about, okay, what is the most important idea or the most important thing that came to my mind? And so that took me a bit of time to sort that out, saying, okay, I rather would like throw in these 3 ideas, but we will probably not get through chapter 2 if I'm throwing in all my ideas that I had, which I think are valuable to a degree, at least for me. So I had to like discard 2 ideas so that I could come up with the 1 idea that I wanted to share. This was, I think this will get better when we are doing that format more often. But today it caused a bit of delay from my side.
I'll say thank you. The quality density is deeply appreciated because your best ideas are amazing.
Thank you.
Dave, feedback, thoughts on iteration?
Yeah, I'm not used to this kind of depth of thinking around books, so I'm trying to get my head into the game because you guys clearly have spent a lot of time. Like I think said last time, I skim. Yeah, I think it was good. But yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at all of the chapters. We've got like 18 chapters to get through. I'm just thinking we are going to be on this book for half a year. I mean, that's not a bad thing, but I mean, that's a half a year. I mean, that's a long time.
So I missed the first half of the session, so I don't really feel qualified to speak about, what could go better or not. But just on that comment Dave just made, maybe if we do our homework, maybe there's an opportunity to pre-lay out some topics from, chapters 3 and 4, and then we could, I don't know, like lean coffee or dot vote which ones, rather than, hitting every single one for every chapter, we could try to speed things up that way if that's a desirable goal.
That would, if I had a piece of feedback for everybody.
Do the homework.
Literally, to be honest, is that the idea when I set the mirror up and the reason why I left lots of space was so that there was a bit of a kind of structural flow through the chapter and an opportunity for you to glance and go, I had this highlight I liked, I had this thing I wanted to talk about, or this thought that had triggered for me, and pre-articulate so that by the time we're actually sitting in the book club, we're really just following the flow of the Miro. We can see where there's density and a desire to pause and dig deep, and we can see where there's, okay, that obviously didn't trigger too much for anybody. Let's just keep rolling. So my encouragement to you during the week and before the next book club would be get in there and drop your thoughts. It really helps me because I can work out where we're just going to kind of gloss through, where we obviously have plenty to talk about. And 1 chapter a week is going to be horrendously slow. I think it's probably a couple of chapters a week, but actually seeing where the good meat is for the conversations as opposed to deliberately examining every concept in every chapter.
I think I can commit to that.
Well, thank you, sir. So on that note, I would like to bring the session to a wrap. Thanks all for turning it up at the various times of day it is for you. And I'm just going to I actually have a stream outro screen now to stop our awkward mid-screen transitions. So thanks. Have a wonderful rest of the day, whatever's left in the day in your part of the world. And I'll see you all soon.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.